Let's go ahead and get started. I'm Timber Biscuit. So this project starts out as most do by breaking down my lumber. Only this time, I'm breaking down lumber that I have existing in the shop. Since I use walnut a lot, I have a ton of excess walnut in the shop, and I felt like this was a good project to use it up. Plus, I've also had these cherry slabs stickered in the corner for about 2 years now, so I figured this would be a perfect place to use one. Since I have such a wide mix of some milled and unmilled lumbers, I'm just going to go ahead and take it one step at a time. So once I struck a straight line out of my cherry, I took it over to the bandsaw to rough cut that line. Now when I'm rough cutting these, I don't need to be perfectly straight because I'm going to take them over to the joiner and clean them up here in a second, but I want to be as close as possible to reduce the amount of milling I actually have to do. So once I've ripped my first straight line, it's easy enough to just flip the board and use the fence as a reference to rip the other side. From there I took my rough cut boards over to the joiner to clean up one face and one edge. And for this type of build, having flat, straight boards is super important. There's a lot of projects that I've built that need pretty flat boards, but for this one, they need to be perfectly flat. So while this isn't the most glamorous process in woodworking, it is especially important. The next step was to resaw some of my thicker boards to pieces that I can use for this build. And for each of these pieces, I was able to get a couple different sections. So these 2 sticks of 8/4 will ultimately be my shiplap panels. One added bonus of cutting out my panels this way is that I end up with grain patterns that match pretty evenly, plus I get the benefit of book matched pieces, which adds a little bit to the design. And while we're on the topic of the design, let's talk a little bit about this piece. So I designed this cabinet to be mathematically perfect, or at least close to it. And by that I mean it's going to follow the golden ratio. And I tried to follow the golden section in more than just one place when I was designing this piece. So as you can see here, the overall cabinet follows the golden section, as well as the door panel. Plus some of the shelves fall in line with where that golden section and golden ratio lies, so I think that really adds to the overall aesthetic. So once I had all my pieces for my shiplap cut out, I went ahead and reset my bandsaw and cut out the pieces for my side panels and shelves. And it's probably worth noting that at this time, all of my pieces are a 1/16 of an inch over the thickness that I need them to be. From there I cut down some of my boards over at the table saw to reserve some of that nicer grain pattern, and then I could mill them down to their final thickness. Now because I kept my pieces thick in the previous steps, this was a nice easy process. I just made sure to check the thickness often to make sure I wasn't overshooting my mark. Because if I overshoot here, that's going to adjust all of the measurements for the entire piece down the line. And if you're looking for the measurements for this piece, the plans for this project will be linked down in the description. Alright, so next it was time to rip all my pieces to width. Now I'm not going for final width here because I'm going to plane back to my final width later on, but I want to get pretty close. And the reason I don't go for a final width right here is that because when doing exposed joinery, it's a really good idea to leave yourself some wiggle room. At any point during a glue up, pieces can shift and move a little bit, and having a little bit of play built into the project makes a world of difference. So for right now, these pieces are about 1/8 of an inch wider than they need to be. Once I had all my pieces cut to their rough width, I could go ahead and cut them down to their rough length. And for that, I'm going to use my crosscut sled. So the first thing I needed to do was trim a clean edge onto the end of all my boards. This will give me a nice reference face for the stop block I'll use here in a second. And when doing a bunch of repeatable cuts in the shop, a stop block is the way to go. And so because this sled we built about a year ago is so long, there's no problem attaching a stop block to the back fence. So once I had this stop in place, I went ahead and cut all the shiplap pieces to their final length. And because the shiplap panel and the sides are the same length, I could go ahead and cut those too. From there I could go ahead and cut out the pieces for my shelves. And here again, I'll just use my crosscut sled and a stop block. And this is pretty much the same for the remainder of the pieces. The only difference between cutting the lengths and widths here are that the lengths are mostly the final size. And I say mostly because my door and drawer pieces will stay oversized until I get to that part of the project later on. So at this point I have all of my cabinet carcass pieces cut to their final length, as well as all the other stock that I'll need for the remainder of the project. So with the milling out of my way, I could start on the panel for the door. And I do this first because A, I want to get it knocked out, and B, it gives me a good idea of how the cherry is going to work with the walnut grain. So once I've planed the edges on the inside seam, I could go ahead and glue up the door front. Now for this cherry panel, I'm going to use Titebond 2 Extend. And the reason being is that Titebond and Titebond 2 tend to have a reaction with cherry after about a year or so, where any areas that come in contact with the glue seam turn red, leaving an almost red Sharpie look. And this has to do with the catalyst that the glue uses for Titebond and Titebond 2. So Titebond 2 Extend seems to not have that reaction, and that's why I use it for cherry. So yeah, Titebond 2 Extend is the cherry on top of cherry. Anyway, next I addressed any knots or holes with some black CA glue. Then I sanded all my boards up to 220 so that I had a nice fit for my dados. Doing this now is a much better option as opposed to doing it after I cut the dados, because doing it after is going to adjust the way that the dados fit. So I laid out my joints on the outside face of one of my side pieces. Then I took the boards over to my table saw and taped those two boards together. This way I can cut the adjoining dados in one pass. This ensures that those dados will line up perfectly. The added benefit of cutting the dados this way is that I can use them down the road to line up my other joints. This is especially useful for this type of build, where the dados don't line up across the entire piece. So once I had my 3 aligning dados cut, I could check the fit with one of my shelves, and yeah, a nice snug fit is what we're looking for. So next I could lay out the remaining dados on the center vertical partition. Now this is going to be a little bit trickier because it doesn't sit flush at the top of the cabinet, but again, using those dados as reference, we can help nail our positioning. And again here I'll use the tape trick to hold my pieces together so that I have a nicely aligned dado. From there I laid out the remaining joints, which was just honestly a process that took a little bit of time. Then I could repeat cutting the dados until I had all my through dados cut. From there it was on to the stop dados. And this is going to be for the shelf that's inside the door. I cut the majority of the joint at the table saw by putting a stop at the end of my sled. This stops the sled before the joint exits the cut and leaves me plenty of space to clean up the joint later on with a chisel. So once I had my vertical pieces cut and I ensured that everything fit properly, I'd go ahead and lay out and cut the joint for the shelf. Now this joint was pretty crucial to the entire piece, because if it was off a little bit left or right, then everything wouldn't be square. So for this piece, I had to really take my time and make sure I lined everything up correctly. And thankfully, after a few taps from my mallet, it seated right in place. Unlike my dog, who seems to only sit when he wants to.
Who's a good boy?
Alright, so next I cut the rabbets into the back of my 2 side pieces. The shiplap panel for the back of the cabinet will rest right in this rabbet. To cut the rabbet, I just bury my dado stack into a sacrificial fence. This gives me a long flat reference face for my board and ensures a nice clean joint. So the next step was to create my shiplap, and the first thing to do was to lay it out. Earlier during the milling process, I mentioned how this would line up really nicely, and it does. So once I have my panel laid out the way I wanted, I marked my rabbet so that I know which side of the board to cut. This helps avoid any confusion while I'm cutting my pieces. Using a similar table saw setup as my previous rabbet, I went ahead and cut alternating rabbets onto each of my slats. Now when you're setting up shiplap, getting the dimensions correct is kind of a pain in the butt, so what I do is cut my shiplap wide and then work my way back to it. It also helps a ton to draw it in full scale so that you can kind of get an idea for the dimensions you're aiming for. Once I have my slats cut, I cut a couple spacers over at the bandsaw and drop them in to make sure I have a nice fit. And if you're enjoying this video and you think it's a good fit for you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you very much for your support. So once I was happy with the way things were coming together, I went ahead and turned my attention back over to the shelves. Now again, those were a little oversized to begin with, so now I'm going to cut them down to where they're about a 32nd of an inch oversized. I did have a couple of shelves that were a little too tight, so I sanded them down to finesse the fit. With that done, I did one more dry assembly before going back to the dados. Now I'm going to use a router plane to clean up the bottom of these dados, because the dado stack tends to leave little points on the outside edges of the joint where the outside blades meet the dado. And I'm not Batman. So using a router plane set to exactly 1/4 of an inch flattens those out and gives me a nice smooth joint across the entire dado. Now this wouldn't be possible if I cut the dados to their full depth earlier on. So if you're planning to use something like a router plane, you want to make sure that you give yourself the room to come back and plane to your final depth. Whenever I'm using the router plane inside of a dado, I'd like to work my way from the edge of the joint back towards the middle. This way I don't blow out the ends while exiting the cut. This also ensures a nice crisp edge to the dado at the reveal point. From there I just repeated the same steps for all the remaining dados. And there's nothing like a speed edit to get through things quickly. Next it was time to finish those cuts on the stop dados. So I first marked out the end of my stop dado, and then I extended the lines of the grooves so that I know where my edges are. From there I could just use a chisel to reinforce my scribe lines, and then I could begin removing the material. When removing material I just use shortcuts and work my way slowly from top to bottom. I try to be careful when I do this to not jam my chisel into the workpiece and gouge out the top surface. Once I have a good amount of material removed with the chisel, I'll turn back to the router plane to remove the remaining material and then turn back to the chisel one more time to clean it up. And from there I can test the fit with one of my shelves. Oh yeah, that's nice. So next I'm going to cut the curves onto the top and bottom of my side pieces. These curves are going to add some visual interest and give a nice side profile. To ensure my two sides match exactly, I went ahead and used double stick tape to stick them together. So to lay those out, I just used a template that I made over at my CNC. But if you don't have a CNC, don't worry, the plans will come with full scale templates. From there I took my side sandwich over to the bandsaw to cut the curves. Now I'm taking time to make sure that I get as close as I can to the curve, but obviously not cutting into my line. Once this is done, I'll clean up my curves with a spoke shave, so I don't have to be perfect here, but we're shooting for as close as possible. With my two sides still attached, I used a combination of a spoke shave and some sandpaper to clean up the curves. Now I'm not able to get on the inside curve with my spoke shave, so I instead wrapped the dowel in some craft foam and stuck some 220 grit sandpaper to it to shape the concave curve. Tongue twister. The next step was to plane back all of my edges. I'm going to do this to have a nice fit and finish for all my shelves as well as my sides. At this point I want things to fit pretty comfortably, but still not all the way flush. I still want the shelves to be slightly oversized so that when I assemble the case, I can plane them back as one full piece. So during this process, it's really important to check the size of my shelves as well as my sides multiple times to make sure that I'm not overshooting anything. Because if I overshoot anything at this point and I have to go back and remake any of these, it wouldn't be a good day. So the last shelf that I needed to cut at the table saw was the bottom shelf. And that's because the bottom profile of the cabinet is now much thinner than it was initially. So once I had the bottom shelf cut to its oversized width, it was time to glue up the case. And for that, I brought in the assistance of my wife. And thankfully, after a few choice words and having some deep, intense conversation with this piece to get it to come together, it finally did. So with the case together, I had my final dimensions and I could start working on the door. And for this project, I'll be building a shaker style door. So the first thing I needed to do was cut my frame to length. Once I had my 4 frame pieces cut to their final length, I could go ahead and cut them to their final width. From there I could set up my blade for cutting the groove for the panel, and that's going to be at 1/4 inch. Now the final joinery for this door is going to be tongue and groove, but I have a small offset between my 2 side stiles and my top and bottom rails. This adds a little depth to the design and makes it more visually interesting. So when I'm cutting these grooves, I'm making sure that the bottom of the panel is against my fence. From there I could go ahead and cut the tongues for my joinery. And I just do that using my miter gauge and a stop. Again, here I'm watching that offset that I talked about earlier to make sure that my tongue matches up with the groove on the side stiles. So just unlock your inner Gene Simmons and control that tongue. Alright, so earlier on I mentioned that the door panel was oversized. So now I'm going to go ahead and cut it to its final length and width. And I cut it to its final length using my miter gauge, and then I cut it to its final width using a ripping blade. From there we can see how everything comes together, and yeah, this looks good. Alright, so with my cabinet glue up dry, I could go ahead and start planing down those shelves. And this is where leaving those shelves slightly oversized really comes in handy, because now I can plane them back so that the entire face of the piece is perfectly flat. So now that the glue up was done, I could go ahead and cut the curve on the top of my center partition. And to do that, I just used a fret saw and cleaned it up with my spoke shave. Now the reason I didn't do this sooner was because clamping it up is a lot easier with it being a flat surface than it is being a curved surface. So once I got that done, I got back to planing those shelves. The key here is just to approach each shelf individually. There's a lot of different joints with different grain patterns matching up here, so I wanted to take my time with each one. When it came to the bottom shelf, I did my best to match the curve with the edge profile. This creates a nice seamless transition. Alright, so next up were the hinges. And to attach those, I'm going to make a quick template. I first use a fence to offset the hinge. Then from there I mark out the center of the drum. Then I can take the template over to the table saw and remove that waste. This will leave me with a perfectly square and accurate template for my hinge. And this same technique can be used for any style of hinge. You just have to adjust where that center line is placed for more decorative hinges. So once I have my template cut, I can set the depth of the router bit to match the height of the hinge. Since I'm using Brousseau hinges with this design, it's really important that these be flush. If it was any other type of hinge, I would set the depth slightly above the thickness of the hinge. And this is due to the way that the hinges by Brousseau work. They're very flat hinges, so there's not any reveal built in, and they need to be mounted flush. But I do love them, so I'll leave a link down in the description for those who are interested. From there, I can just use my template bit to hog out the majority of the material, and then I come back with a chisel to clean up that edge. Once I have both my hinge mortises cut, I transfer those using a marking knife onto the cabinet, and then I just repeat that process again for the other side. After a few minutes, our hinge mortises are done. Next, I could go ahead and glue up the door. While you could do this before you cut the hinges, I find it a lot easier not to have to deal with the door as a large piece. But again, that's just a personal choice. So with a pair of parallel clamps clamping the door in place, I go ahead and get started on the drawer. And what I first needed to do was cut down my drawer face to the exact size of my opening. I want this to be a very snug fit at this point, so again, I could plane it back later on. So once I got my measurement off the actual workpiece, I took it over to the crosscut sled and cut it to its final length. And I'll do the same process for the drawer back, but I'll cut it about a 32nd of an inch shorter than I did the drawer front. And this is to allow for a smooth action when pulling the drawer in and out of the case. Now the drawer back isn't to its final size yet, but we'll finesse that once the dovetails are cut. From there I could go ahead and cut in the groove for the drawer bottom. Once I had the groove cut, I finessed all the pieces to their final width using a hand plane and some sandpaper, as any adjustments after this would alter the way that the dovetails fit. So from there it was on to cutting half-blind dovetails for the drawer front. Now here I'm just marking out the width of my stock and then transferring those markings onto each of my pieces. From there I could lay out the dovetails, and I'll do that using a guide. I like the look of the 1/8 ratio dovetails, so that's what I'm using here. And I'm using really thin pins and a thin reveal at the front of the drawer because I like the way that that looks as well. Dovetails are pretty personal, so you can do this however you like. From there I could cut the tails onto my sideboard. And I like cutting the tails first because I feel like it's easier to transfer them onto the drawer front. So once I've established my cut line, I can use a chisel to reinforce my scribe line. From there I can just use my saw to remove the remaining material. To cut out the center pin, I just use a fret saw, swooping down to the bottom and then cutting across. The remaining material is removed using my chisels and a mallet. From there, I could transfer those dovetails onto the pins board. And to do that, I just use my plane to keep things flat, and to help align the pieces, I use a small scrap in the groove for the drawer bottom. I find it best to use a really thin marking knife for this process, otherwise fitting it into the pins can be kind of tricky. From there I can mark out the waist, and then extend the lines to the drawer back. Next I take the board over to my drill press and remove the bulk of the material using a Forstner bit. This is a nice trick that really cuts down on the amount of chiseling you gotta do. From there I could remove the remaining tail material, and for that I go back to my chisels and a mallet. Now this is just one of those time consuming things, so I'm not going to show the removal of all the waste, but basically you want to take an imaginary line and place it right in the center of your scribe line and your waist. From there you want to half that line over and over again until you've reached your scribe line. Now again, this will just take a little bit of time. When you're working with the grain, just be careful not to take a huge chunk out, as a little chiseling goes a long way. If your dovetails are a little snug, you can undercut the back and bottom areas of your dovetails, and that'll give you a better fit. Now if your dovetails aren't perfectly flat, don't worry too much, as you can just plane those back to a nice fit later on. So here I'm not quite done, but I'll end up chamfering the back of these tails so that it has a nice snug fit. Alright, so now that I have the half blinds cut on the drawer front, I can work on the drawer back. And for that, I'm just going to use a rabbet joint. So I first cut a shoulder into my rabbet, and then I remove the remaining material using the crosscut sled. One thing I forgot to mention earlier is that I left these drawer sides a little long. This way if I mess up on the tails, I could cut them off and try again. From there, I just use a shoulder plane to flatten everything out. And since I'm doing a 1/4 inch rabbet on each side, I remove 1/2 inch from my drawer back. This will still leave that 32nd of an inch offset we cut in earlier. Once I've cut out my drawer bottom, I could go ahead and glue everything up. And for that, I'll just use a pair of parallel clamps and a pair of F-style clamps. This gives even clamping pressure across all the joints. It's definitely important here to check things for square, and if it's not, place a clamp on an angle so that you can square it back up. From there I could just use a 1/4 inch rabbet Once the glue is dried, I can start finessing the fit for the drawer box. Now, again, I cut this to be perfect for the drawer, so not everything's glued up, it's not sliding in excellent. But after a little bit of old-fashioned hand planing, it fits great. So now, we're on to the pulls. And for that, I just used a piece of straight grain that I had from an offcut. So once I cut it to just over its width at the table saw, I took it over to the planer to really clean up that edge. This is also a really fast way to dial in that height. Now, this isn't going to be the final height that I go with, but it gives me enough to work with. From there, I just use a table saw to remove the edges and cut in a rabbet on either side of the pull. So now I've got this kind of long extrusion of pull material, and I need to trim the pulls down to their final width. So I mark those out with a marking knife and then use my crosscut sled to cut them out. I also stuck a strip of tape to the back edge so I didn't get any blowout and risk ruining that grain. So once I had a few pulls trimmed out, I took them over to my bandsaw to cut an 1/8 inch off the end and match the rabbet. This gives a nice profile to the entire pull. With the piece clamped tight, I could remove the remaining material with a pull saw. From there, I just use a marking knife to extend my line and then clean up the edge with a chisel. Now, while I did have an idea of what I wanted these pulls to look like in my original design, I didn't actually flesh them out until I was in the shop. And I think that that's one of the cool things about working with pieces like this, is that as you go, you kind of get to make design decisions. And I think ultimately these pulls match the overall aesthetic for the entire piece. The only change I might do is add a small curve to each pull, and I may go back and do that one day, but for now, I think these are great. So once I had constructed a routing template, I went ahead and finessed the fit of the pulls. And I did that using a shoulder plane and some chisels. Once I was happy with the fit, I could lay out the positioning for the mortise on my door frame. Now I'll cut these out really similarly to how I did the hinges, by starting with a router to remove the bulk of the material, and then use my chisels to follow the template and clean up the rounded corners. The biggest difference here is that the bit is trapped in the template, so I have to gently apply pressure to plunge it into the wood. When it comes to cleaning up the corners, I just take my time to make sure that my chisels are following the template correctly. As another side note, I'm just careful not to jostle this too much and remove the template from the double-sided tape. So once I have my door pull fitting snug, I can go ahead and repeat that process for my drawer front. Only this time I'm going to run the pull horizontally to match the drawer face. Again, I'm careful not to be too aggressive here and remove that double stick tape. And at this point the pulls are a little tall for my taste, so I took them back over to the bandsaw to trim off a little bit of that height. Once I was happy with the thickness, I could glue them in place. And to do that, I'm just using a bit of Titebond Dark, and then I tap them in with the mallet to make sure they have a nice flush fit. If at this point the pulls weren't going in smoothly, I could chamfer the bottom to give it a little relief and make it slide into the mortise a little easier. If you enjoy these videos and you want to support the show, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon, where you'll get discount codes on plans and merch, plus an invite to the Discord server, and some other free stuff. And for those of you who have already joined, thank you so much for your support. Alright, now back to the show. I waited until now to fit the door because I didn't want to have to attach and remove the hinges multiple times, as doing so repeatedly risks breaking the brass screws. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started on those hinges. Once I tested the fit for my door, I used a center punch to mark the screw location for my hinges. Then I pre-drilled those holes and used the steel screw that comes with the set of Brousseau hinges to cut in my threads. Since brass is so soft, I really don't want to use that to cut in my threads, as doing so risks breaking the screw off in the hole. So once I have one set of threads cut, I alternate the screws until I have both brass screws attached. From there, I could do the same procedure on the cabinet. Only this time, because the material is so thin on the cabinet, I ended up having to grind down the screws. Which also means that I need to add a little bit more support to the screw hole. So I add a few drops of CA glue to help secure the screws. Once I was happy with the action, I laid out a spot for a magnetic catch. Now, I'm not using a traditional catch, but rather I'm going to use 2 hidden magnets to hold the door in place. So I first marked the position on the cabinet, and then transferred those markings to the bottom of the door. So once I had everything marked out, I could drill in a hole for the magnet. To secure the magnets in place, I'm just using some CA glue. With both my magnets in place, it was time for the finish. And for the finish in this piece, I'm going with an oil and wax blend. This will really bring out the grain pattern in the cherry and walnut and give the overall piece a nice natural look. I also think that the oil brings a lot of warmth to the piece, and with cherry and walnut, I think that's a good thing. Now, if a natural look isn't your thing, you can definitely use whatever finish you want. I just like this because it applies easily, and it's super easy to repair if necessary. So after 2 coats in 24 hours, it was time to attach the shiplap. And to do that, I glue in my 2 edge pieces first, and then use some brad nails to tack them to the back of the shelves. Once I have my 2 ends attached, I can drop in the remaining shiplap and then use the spacers I cut earlier to correctly space them. Now I could leave my brand. Once that was done, it was time to attach some keyhole brackets, and then finally the door. I started out by saying that this cabinet may have just been the most challenging thing I've ever made. And at the end of the project, I'm gonna say that statement was true. But I think it was worth the challenge, and it turned out beautifully. And I'm not sure whether that's the math or the craftsmanship, but either way, I'll take it. This project challenged me in ways that I haven't been challenged as a craftsman before. And I'm happy to say that I've grown and learned a ton from the experience. So if you're a woodworker looking for a challenging project, consider building yourself a cabinet. You won't regret the lessons you learn, and at the end of the day, you'll have a beautiful piece to showcase your work. And if you enjoyed this project and you want to see more, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you guys next time.